Two women, Mrs. Meserve and Mrs. Emerson, are talking when Mrs. Meserve tells her friend that a family who has just moved from Boston has bought the famous haunted house in the city. Talking about the house, Mrs. Meserve decides to tell her friend about the meeting she had in the past with a real ghost. She was a teacher, and she lived with two other women, Mrs. Dennison and Mrs. Bird, in East Wilmington. One night she heard someone knocking at her bedroom door. She opened it and saw a dreadful child. The child looked as a ghost and was constantly saying, "I can't find my mother." Mrs. Meserve tried to talk to it, but the only answer she got was, "I can't find my mother." Then the ghost disappeared. So she immediately called her roommates to tell them what was just happened. But on the contrary, they weren't surprised. They knew about the ghost. Time passed. One morning, Mrs. Bird was not feeling well and stayed in her bed to recover. Mrs. Dennison and Mrs. Meserve were in the kitchen making breakfast as usual, when suddenly Mrs. Dennison saw Mrs. Bird's ghost wandering in the garden, holding the dead child's hand. So they ran immediately in Mrs. Bird's bedroom and saw that she was dead. Since that moment, Mrs. Meserve started to believe in ghosts, and anyone saw the little child's ghost again.
Created using Powtoon.